Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 did not begin dramatically. It began early, usually before sunrise, often before the household itself had fully remembered it existed. A servant's day started in quiet darkness, somewhere below the main floors of the house, in rooms that were functional rather than comfortable, and cold rather than welcoming. These basement spaces were not designed for rest so much as recovery, the bare minimum required to stand up and work again the next morning. Beds were narrow, mattresses thin, and privacy was mostly theoretical. Several servants often shared the same room, arranged in ranks like stored furniture that happened to breathe. By the time the household above stirred, servants had already been awake for hours. Fires needed lighting, ashes from the night before had to be cleaned out, coal hauled in, and hearths coaxed back to life. In large houses, this meant dozens of fireplaces across multiple floors, each one demanding attention. A fire not properly lit was considered a personal failure, and smoke leaking into the room above could earn a sharp rebuke before breakfast had even been mentioned. Breakfast itself was a strangely distant concept. Servants rarely ate what the family ate, and rarely at the same time. Meals were taken quickly, often standing, and almost always after duties were already underway. Food was filling rather than pleasant. Bread, porridge, maybe leftover scraps if luck allowed. Hunger was not unusual, but it was also not discussed. Complaining about food suggested ingratitude, which was professionally unwise. The hierarchy among servants was rigid and exhausting in its own way. Even while serving others, servants were constantly aware of their own position. The butler outranked the footman, the housekeeper outranked the maid. Junior servants answered to everyone and were blamed by default. This structure was enforced not only by rules, but by constant observation. You were always being watched by someone, even when no one was speaking to you, especially when no one was speaking to you. Most servants spent their days moving silently through spaces designed to erase them. Back staircases, narrow corridors, and separate entrances ensured that servants appeared only when required and vanished immediately after. Being noticed was usually a sign that something had gone wrong. The ideal servant was efficient, invisible, and forgettable. Praise was rare. Silence was the standard reward. Physical exhaustion was constant. Tasks involved scrubbing floors on hands and knees, carrying heavy water jugs, polishing metal until it reflected light that servants themselves were not meant to enjoy. Laundry was particularly punishing. Washing clothes meant hauling water, heating it manually, wringing fabric by hand, and repeating the process until fingers were raw and cracked. This work could take an entire day and then some, depending on the size of the household and the social calendar of its owners. Servants also lived under strict moral expectations. Any hint of impropriety could result in instant dismissal. Romantic relationships were discouraged, pregnancies were disastrous, and reputation mattered more than skill. Losing a position often meant losing housing at the same time, which made unemployment terrifying. Many servants stayed in unpleasant situations simply because leaving was worse. Time off existed in theory. In practice, it was limited, irregular, and easily revoked. An afternoon off might be granted once a month, provided nothing unexpected happened. Something unexpected always happened. When servants did leave the house, they were expected to return promptly, sober and unchanged by the experience. By the end of the day, long after the household had settled into comfort upstairs, servants were still moving quietly through darkened rooms, extinguishing lamps, checking doors, and preparing everything to be repeated again the next morning. When they finally lay down, it was with the knowledge that the bell could ring at any hour, summoning them back into motion. Sleep, like most things in a Victorian servant's life, was conditional. This was not a hidden life in the sense of mystery. It was hidden because it was designed to be ignored, and for the servants of 1885, being ignored was both the goal and the cost of survival. Morning in a Victorian household did not arrive gently for servants. It arrived with bells, sharp, sudden, and entirely indifferent to whatever sleep had been achieved. Bells were the household's nervous system, and servants were expected to respond instantly, correctly, and without visible irritation. Each bell meant a specific room, a specific person, and a specific task. Confusing one bell for another was not a small mistake. It suggested incompetence. In some houses, it suggested replacement. Dressing the household was a ritual that required patience, precision, and a surprising amount of silence. Clothes were layered, buttoned, tied, adjusted, and smoothed. Servants became intimately familiar with garments they would never wear themselves. Corsets were tightened, collars stiffened, boots polished again even if they had been polished the night before. The body of the servant bent, knelt, and reached in ways that slowly reshaped it over time. Back pain was common. So was saying nothing about it. Cleaning never truly ended. Dust returned almost immediately, carried in by coal smoke, city air, and the simple act of living. Victorian homes were filled with heavy fabrics, carved furniture, and decorative objects that collected grime enthusiastically. Servants wiped, brushed, swept, and scrubbed constantly, knowing the results would be temporary. A perfectly clean room could look tired again within hours. This was not discouraging so much as expected. Noise management was another invisible skill. Doors were closed softly, footsteps were controlled, crockery was handled as though it might explode if offended. A dropped plate could shatter more than porcelain. It could shatter trust. Accidents were remembered. Forgiveness was not guaranteed. Servants learned to read moods quickly. A glance, a pause, a tone of voice could indicate whether the household was content or on edge. On bad days, servants worked more quietly, spoke less, and moved faster. On good days, they did exactly the same thing, but with slightly less tension in the shoulders. There was no true relaxation while on duty. There was only reduced alertness, which could be dangerous if misjudged. Meals upstairs were performances that required intense preparation below. Servants set tables they would never sit at, carried dishes they would never taste, and stood waiting for cues that might not come for long stretches of time. Standing still was often more exhausting than movement. Muscles tightened, feet ached. Faces remained neutral. The goal was to exist without appearing bored, tired, or human. Downstairs meals were brief and practical. Conversation was limited, partly from exhaustion and partly from the understanding that walls carried sound. Gossip could travel upward, and not in a helpful way. Even among themselves, servants practiced caution. Loyalty to fellow staff existed, but self-preservation usually came first. Healthcare was minimal. A servant who became ill was inconvenient. Mild illness was worked through. Severe illness risked dismissal. There was little sympathy for ongoing weakness. If you could stand, you could work. If you could not, someone else would be found who could. Injuries healed slowly under continued strain, and many never healed properly at all. Letters from family were treasured but infrequent. Many servants lived far from home, having entered service as teenagers. Returning home permanently was rare. Service became not just a job, but an identity that followed people for life. Skills learned in service were specific and rarely transferable to better opportunities. Evening brought a brief shift in rhythm, but not in workload. Dinner was longer, more formal, and more demanding. Servants waded through courses, cleared quietly, and responded to requests that could arrive at any moment. Only once the household retired did the pace slow slightly. Before sleep, preparations began again. Clothes were laid out. Fires were banked. Floors were checked one last time. Everything was arranged for a morning that would arrive too soon. When servants finally returned to their quarters, exhaustion was deep but restless. Muscles ached. Thoughts drifted. The bell might ring. In this way, days blended together. Not dramatically, just steadily. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was not marked by singular tragedies so much as by constant endurance. And for most servants, endurance was considered enough. As weeks turned into months, time for Victorian servants developed a strange texture. Days felt long while years passed quietly. There were few clear markers to separate one season from another, aside from changes in workload and temperature. Winter meant colder corridors, frozen fingers, and heavier clothing that made movement slower. Summer brought longer days, more dust, and the unpleasant combination of heat and constant physical labor. Comfort was never the point. Endurance was. Clothing for servants was practical, durable, and unremarkable by design. Uniforms were meant to signal order and discipline, not individuality. They were worn for long hours and replaced infrequently. Mending was often done by servants themselves late at night under poor light. A frayed cuff or loose button could be interpreted as carelessness. Appearance mattered even if the person inside the clothing did not. Social class was reinforced constantly, often in small, quiet ways. Servants used different doors, different staircases, and different streets. They occupied spaces that were narrower, darker, and easier to clean. This separation was not always enforced with cruelty. More often, it was enforced with habit. It was simply how things were done. Questioning it would have been seen as odd, or worse, ambitious. Education among servants varied widely. Some could read and write fluently. Others could barely sign their names. Opportunities for learning were limited by exhaustion and lack of time. A servant who read in the evenings might be seen as admirable or suspicious, depending on the household. Reading suggested thought. Thought suggested dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction was dangerous. Children in service had it particularly hard. Many began work as young as 10 or 12, assigned small but constant tasks that kept them busy all day. They ran messages, cleaned shoes, carried coal, and learned quickly not to complain. Childhood ended quietly in service. There was no clear moment when it disappeared. It simply stopped being relevant. Servants were expected to be loyal, but loyalty was rarely reciprocal. Households could dismiss staff with little notice. References determined future employment, and a single negative comment could close many doors. This made servants cautious. They endured unreasonable demands, long hours, and personal insults because leaving without a reference was worse than staying. Despite this, small forms of resistance existed: a task done slowly, a look exchanged between coworkers, a minor shortcut taken when no one was watching. These were not rebellions, they were survival techniques. They allowed servants to feel briefly human in a system that required them to function more like tools. Religion played a complicated role. Church attendance was often mandatory, but faith could be both comfort and obligation. Sundays were not true days off. They simply involved different work, different clothes, and slightly less noise. Servants sat separately in church, reinforcing the same divisions found everywhere else. Even prayer followed the hierarchy. Illness and aging brought uncertainty. There was no pension for most servants. Saving money was difficult on low wages, especially when uniforms and basic needs consumed much of it. Older servants sometimes remained in service as long as physically possible, aware that leaving could mean poverty. Younger servants watched this and learned what awaited them. Friendships among servants were real but restrained. Trust took time. People came and went frequently, dismissed or leaving for marginally better positions. Saying goodbye was common. Getting attached was risky. Romance existed quietly, often under rules that made it fragile. Many relationships ended before they had time to begin. Silence remained a defining feature of the job. Servants learned to work without conversation, without acknowledgement, and without visible emotion. This silence followed them even when they were alone. Thoughts were kept internal. Feelings were managed privately. Expression was a luxury. At night, lying in shared rooms or narrow beds, servants listened to the house settle. The sounds of pipes, distant footsteps, and wind outside became familiar companions. Sleep came unevenly, interrupted by anticipation of the bell. Dreams, when they arrived, were often practical. Work continued there too. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was not defined by a single hardship. It was defined by accumulation, small discomforts layered over years until they became normal. The hidden life of servants was not hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because it was constant, quiet, and designed to leave no trace. Privacy for Victorian servants was a concept rather than a reality. Living spaces were shared, schedules were controlled, and personal time was monitored even when it technically belonged to you. Bedrooms were arranged for efficiency, not comfort. Trunks held all personal possessions, which meant a person's entire private life could be packed into a box small enough to carry. This made moving common and routes difficult. Letters were reread until the paper softened. Small keepsakes were kept hidden, not out of shame but practicality. Anything that looked too personal risked questions. Questions led to assumptions. Assumptions led to trouble. Most servants learned to keep their inner lives tidy and unobservable. Rules governed nearly everything. How to address employers. When to speak. When not to exist at all. Speaking without being spoken to was a mistake. Offering opinions was unnecessary. Correct posture mattered. So did facial expression. A neutral face was safest. Too cheerful seemed insincere. Too serious seemed resentful. The correct expression was a practiced calm that revealed nothing. Money was a constant calculation. Wages were low, paid infrequently, and often reduced by deductions for uniforms or breakages. Saving required discipline and luck. Many servants sent portions of their earnings home to support family members, leaving little for themselves. Unexpected expenses could undo months of careful restraint. Shoes wore out, clothing tore. Illness arrived uninvited. Alcohol was both relief and risk. Some servants drank to dull exhaustion. Others avoided it entirely, aware that even rumors of drunkenness could cost them employment. Public houses offered brief escape, but discretion was essential. Being seen too often, or in the wrong company, raised questions. Respectability was fragile and constantly evaluated. Punishment in service was usually quiet, rarely dramatic. More often, it came as reduced privileges, harsher assignments, or cold disapproval that lingered. The absence of trust was its own penalty. Once lost, it was rarely restored. Servants learned to fear silence from employers more than anger. Silence meant replacement was being considered. Seasonal events changed the workload without improving conditions. Holidays meant more guests, more cleaning, more pressure to perform perfection while exhausted. Celebrations upstairs increased labor downstairs. Servants watched joy happen at a distance measured by the number of dishes used and candles burned. Travel was limited. Seeing another town was unusual. Seeing the countryside was rare. The world existed mostly through stories told by others or glimpsed briefly during errands. This made the household feel enormous and inescapable. For many servants, the house was not just a workplace. It was the boundary of life. Training new servants added another layer of responsibility. Senior staff were expected to instruct juniors while maintaining standards. Mistakes made by trainees reflected poorly on those teaching them. Patience was required, though rarely available. This created tension among servants where hierarchy existed even in shared hardship. There were moments of kindness, a warm cup of tea left unnoticed, a word of thanks spoken quietly. These moments stood out precisely because they were rare. They were remembered long after being given, replayed during difficult days. Kindness did not change the system, but it softened its edges briefly. Death was a practical concern. When a servant died, duties continued. Rooms were cleaned, positions were filled. Grief was private and short. There was no allowance for mourning beyond what did not disrupt the household. This taught servants to compartmentalize loss efficiently. Hope existed, but it was narrow. Advancement meant moving to a slightly better household, a slightly higher position, or a role with marginally less physical strain. Dreams of independence were quiet and cautious. Many servants aimed not for happiness, but for stability. At night, the house creaked and settled, and servants learned its rhythms by sound. Which stairboard complained? Which door stuck? These details became intimate knowledge. The house was known better than its occupants, yet it did not belong to them. By continuing day after day, servants learned something essential. Invisibility was a skill. It required effort, discipline, and restraint. To be unnoticed was not passive. It was labor. And for Victorian servants in 1885, mastering that labor was often the difference between survival and dismissal. Their lives unfolded in service corridors and shared rooms, measured not by years, but by routines. It was not a life designed to be remembered. It was a life designed to function, quietly, consistently, without interruption. Over time, servants developed an unusual relationship with obedience. It was not blind loyalty so much as practiced anticipation. Good servants learned to predict requests before they were spoken, to arrange objects before they were noticed missing, and to correct problems before they became visible. This anticipation was exhausting. It required constant awareness, like holding one's breath for hours at a time, hoping not to exhale at the wrong moment. Mistakes, when they happened, were rarely dramatic. They were small and accumulative. A teacup placed slightly off-center, a curtain not drawn evenly, a hallway lamp left burning too long. Individually, these were nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Patterns were remembered. Servants learned to fear patterns more than errors, because patterns suggested character. Reputation followed servants from house to house. References were brief but powerful. A single word like satisfactory could mean stability. A phrase like adequate but slow could quietly end a career. Servants understood this and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Speed mattered. So did silence. Efficiency was admired, but not if it appeared rushed. There was a correct pace to everything, and discovering it took time few could afford. Personal ambition was managed carefully. Wanting advancement was acceptable. Wanting too much advancement was suspicious. A maid hoping to become a housekeeper was reasonable. A maid hoping to leave service entirely was not discussed. The idea that service was temporary existed mostly in theory. For many, it became permanent by default. Weather affected work more than it affected those upstairs. Rain meant more mud, more cleaning, more strain. Snow meant frozen pipes, slippery steps, and early mornings spent hauling water that burned the skin with cold. Summer heat turned kitchens into endurance tests. Servants sweated, fainted, and recovered quietly. Complaints were considered weakness. Endurance was assumed. Medical care, when available, was basic. Home remedies were common. A servant with a persistent cough might be given syrup and told to rest briefly, then return to work. Rest was measured in minutes. Pain was managed through habit rather than treatment. Many learned to ignore it until it became impossible to stand. Even then, standing was often attempted. Servants rarely saw their own reflections clearly. Mirrors were placed upstairs, where appearances mattered. Downstairs spaces were practical and dim. Self-perception was shaped more by how others responded than by how one looked. Being corrected frequently created a sense of constant inadequacy, even among skilled workers. Confidence existed quietly, if at all. Language itself was controlled. Certain words were avoided. Certain tones were required. Servants learned to speak plainly, without flourish. Humor was risky. Sarcasm was unacceptable. Silence, again, was safest. Over time, many found it difficult to express themselves freely, even outside of work. Restraint became instinct. Occasionally, a servant left unexpectedly, dismissed, married, taken ill. Their absence was noted briefly, then absorbed. Duties were redistributed. Life continued. This impermanence created emotional distance. Attachment was possible, but it was measured. People learned to keep parts of themselves uninvested. Festivities highlighted inequality without needing to mention it. During holidays, servants worked longer hours to create an atmosphere they did not share. Music drifted down stairwells. Laughter echoed through corridors. Servants listened while polishing, carrying, waiting. The contrast was not bitter so much as familiar. It confirmed what was already understood. Some servants took pride in their work. A well-run household reflected their competence, even if credit went elsewhere. Order became a personal achievement. Cleanliness became proof of worth. This pride was private, but real. It provided a sense of control in a system that offered little. Education, if pursued, happened quietly. A book read by candlelight. A letter practiced slowly. Knowledge was gained in fragments. Advancement through learning was rare, but learning itself offered a small escape. Thinking, at least, remained free. As years passed, servants aged into the work. Movement slowed. Strength diminished. Adaptation followed. Lighter tasks were taken when possible. Younger staff handled heavier loads. This arrangement depended on goodwill and circumstance. Not all were so fortunate. The idea of retirement was vague. Some hoped to save enough to leave service. Others hoped to stay useful long enough to avoid destitution. Planning beyond that was difficult. The future existed as a narrow path, not a wide horizon. At the end of another long day, servants returned to their shared rooms. They removed uniforms that smelled of smoke, polish, and effort. Muscles relaxed reluctantly. Silence settled. Tomorrow would be similar. Predictable, demanding, and quietly endured. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 continued not through drama, but through repetition. Each day resembled the last closely enough to blur. The hidden life was not hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because it was ordinary, sustained by people whose labor was designed to disappear. By the middle of a servant's working life, fatigue had settled into something more permanent. It was no longer just tiredness at the end of the day. It became a background condition, a steady, dull weight carried from morning to night. Servants learned to function within it, adjusting movements and expectations. Energy was rationed carefully, saved for tasks that required it, withheld from everything else. Memory played a quiet role in daily survival. Servants memorized the habits of the household with remarkable accuracy. Which floorboard creaked too loudly? Which drawer stuck? Which cup was preferred at breakfast? These details mattered. Remembering them reduced friction. Forgetting them created problems. Over time, the house itself became a kind of map stored in the body, navigated without conscious thought. Change was unsettling. A new employer, a visiting relative, or even rearranged furniture could disrupt routines and increase anxiety. Servants adapted quickly because they had to, but adaptation required effort. Effort meant exhaustion. Familiarity was a form of comfort, even when the conditions themselves were harsh. Discipline was enforced subtly. Written rules existed, but the most powerful expectations were unspoken. A raised eyebrow, a pause before an instruction, a glance exchanged between senior staff. These signals carried meaning. Servants became fluent in reading them. Misreading them could lead to embarrassment or worse. Loneliness was common, even in crowded houses. Constant proximity did not guarantee connection. Conversations were brief, cautious, and often interrupted. Trust developed slowly. Friendships formed, but they existed within limits. Too much closeness could become a liability if one person left suddenly or fell out of favor. The city outside continued its life mostly unseen. News arrived secondhand, filtered through conversations overheard or newspapers left behind. Major events were acknowledged briefly, then absorbed into routine. Work continued regardless of political change, economic uncertainty, or public excitement. The household was its own small world, largely indifferent to the rest. Servants rarely expressed anger openly. Anger was dangerous. It suggested resistance. Instead, frustration settled into silence. Emotions were compressed, folded inward, and stored. Over time, this created a reserved demeanor that could be mistaken for calm. In truth, it was containment. Gender shaped experience in quiet ways. Female servants faced additional scrutiny, particularly regarding behavior and appearance. Male servants were expected to display physical strength and restraint. Both were judged constantly. Expectations overlapped, but pressure was universal. Failure was personal, even when the system made it inevitable. The soundscape of service was familiar and repetitive. The scrape of chairs, the clink of cutlery, the soft thud of doors closed carefully. These sounds marked time more reliably than clocks. A servant could tell the hour by listening. This auditory awareness never fully turned off, even during sleep. Dreams often replayed the day's tasks. Bells rang, fires needed tending. Someone was waiting. Rest did not always mean escape. The mind remained on duty long after the body lay still. Waking was easy, relaxing was not. Occasionally, a servant witnessed moments of intimacy upstairs, laughter, arguments, vulnerability. These moments were glimpsed accidentally and quickly forgotten, or pretended to be forgotten. Servants were expected to know much and acknowledge nothing. Discretion was essential. It was also isolating. Personal identity slowly narrowed. People described themselves by role rather than personality. Cook, maid, footman. Titles replaced names. This simplification made life manageable but limited. It was easier to perform a role than to maintain a sense of self under constant observation. Some servants left service and struggled to adjust. Freedom brought uncertainty. Choices required energy and confidence that had been suppressed for years. Others remained in service because it was familiar. Familiarity felt safer than possibility. As the years accumulated, time blurred. Servants remembered beginnings clearly, middles vaguely, and endings not at all. Days repeated, seasons cycled, faces changed. Work continued. This continuity was not celebrated, but it was relied upon. At night, as the house settled once again, servants prepared themselves for another day that would resemble the last closely enough to require no explanation. Clothes were folded. Shoes were placed carefully. Small rituals provided structure in a life with little control. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was not defined by ambition or fulfillment. It was defined by reliability. Being there, doing the work, leaving no evidence behind. The hidden life continued, not because it was secret, but because it was absorbed into the background, steady and unremarkable. Like the ticking of a clock no one bothered to notice. Authority in a Victorian household was layered and precise. Orders rarely came directly from the top. They filtered downward through senior staff, changing tone slightly at each level. By the time an instruction reached a junior servant, it was no longer a request, but an expectation already overdue. This system allowed employers to remain distant while control remained absolute. Servants learned quickly where power truly sat and where it did not. The housekeeper and butler occupied an uneasy middle ground. They enforced rules while remaining subject to them. Their authority was real but conditional. A housekeeper could reprimand a maid, but she herself answered to the employer's mood. This created a careful balancing act. Too lenient, and standards slipped. Too strict, and resentment grew. Managing people who were already exhausted required tact that was rarely acknowledged. Work rhythms followed the household's social calendar. Dinner parties, guests, and seasonal visits increased labor without warning. Servants prepared for events that lasted hours and cleaned up long after they ended. Sleep was shortened, meals were missed. The next morning arrived regardless. These disruptions were temporary for those upstairs and cumulative for those below. Traveling with a household introduced new challenges. Servants packed, unpacked, and repacked familiar objects into unfamiliar spaces. They learned new layouts quickly, memorized new routes, and adapted to different kitchens and corridors. Travel was not leisure. It was work in a different location, often with less support and more scrutiny. Illness among employers added pressure. When someone upstairs fell sick, servants worked harder. Rooms were aired, linens changed repeatedly, meals adjusted, and quiet enforced. Sympathy existed, but it was practical. Servants could not afford to become ill themselves during these periods. Their own health was postponed until the household recovered. Servants were expected to maintain moral standards that reflected well on the family. This included behavior outside the house. A servant seen in questionable company risked damaging not just their own reputation, but the household's. As a result, social lives were narrow and cautious. Leisure existed within approved boundaries, which limited spontaneity. Discipline extended to posture and movement. Standing straight mattered. Walking briskly but not hurriedly mattered. Hands were kept busy or folded properly. Stillness was controlled. These physical habits shaped the body over time. Servants carried themselves with a reserved efficiency that often remained even after leaving service. Conversation upstairs was overheard but never acknowledged. Political opinions, family disagreements, and private concerns passed through service corridors as background noise. Servants became repositories of unspoken knowledge. This awareness carried responsibility. Revealing it would end employment. Carrying it silently was part of the job. The idea of fairness was complicated. Some employers were considered kind. Others were not. Most existed somewhere in between. Kindness did not remove hierarchy, it softened it slightly. A kind employer still expected obedience. A harsh one simply made it explicit. Servants learned to adjust expectations accordingly. Training emphasized repetition. Tasks were demonstrated once, then expected to be remembered forever. Forgetting was interpreted as carelessness. Learning curves were short and unforgiving. This created anxiety for new servants who worked under constant fear of making irreversible mistakes. Confidence, when it developed, was fragile. Servants measured success by absence of comment. A day without correction was a good day. A week without reprimand was rare. Praise, when it occurred, felt unexpected and slightly uncomfortable. Many servants did not know how to respond to it. Gratitude was expressed briefly, then forgotten in routine. Noise from the city occasionally intruded. Street vendors, carts, and distant crowds reminded servants that life existed beyond the house. These sounds were both comforting and unsettling. They suggested freedom, but also uncertainty. The outside world was larger, louder, and less predictable than service life. The passing of years brought subtle shifts. Younger servants replaced older ones. Skills were passed on quietly. Stories were shared selectively. Experience accumulated but was rarely rewarded. Longevity did not guarantee security. It only increased familiarity. Servants often imagined alternative lives in small ways. A shop of their own. A quiet cottage. A different household. These thoughts were not plans. They were moments of mental rest. They allowed the mind to step outside the corridor briefly before returning to work. At night, exhaustion muted reflection. Bodies sank into beds. Conversations faded quickly. Tomorrow's tasks were already known. Surprise was unlikely. Consistency was expected. This predictability was both burden and comfort. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 continued through discipline rather than inspiration. It was sustained by routine, enforced by hierarchy, and carried forward by people who learned to adapt quietly. The hidden life remained steady, not because it was easy, but because stopping was rarely an option. Age revealed itself slowly in service. It was not announced. It arrived in smaller steps, in the way knees protested on stairs or how hands stiffened in the cold before loosening again. Servants noticed these changes privately and adjusted without comment. Admitting weakness risked being seen as expendable, so the body adapted while the mind learned to ignore discomfort that had once seemed impossible to overlook. Younger servants watched this process closely. They learned what endurance looked like over decades. It was not dramatic decline. It was gradual accommodation. Tasks were done a little more carefully, movements slightly slower, strength conserved for what truly required it. Experience replaced speed, though speed was still expected. Respect for senior servants existed, but it was practical rather than sentimental. Older staff knew the household better. They remembered past mistakes, previous employers, and unspoken rules. This knowledge was valuable. It offered some protection, but not certainty. Loyalty did not guarantee permanence, it merely delayed replacement. Money saved over years was guarded carefully. Coins were counted, hidden, and reconsidered often. Savings represented options, however limited, a few months of independence, a cushion against illness. For many, it was not enough. Still, the act of saving itself created a sense of agency, however small. Leaving service was frightening. Servants who departed voluntarily often discovered that freedom required decisions they had not practiced making. Daily structure vanished. Time needed filling. The outside world expected initiative. Some adapted. Others returned to service, not out of failure, but familiarity. Familiar hardship felt safer than unfamiliar choice. Death within the household changed little in routine. Mourning was organized, efficient, and contained. Black clothing appeared. Voices softened. Work continued. Servants supported grief without sharing it. Emotional involvement was neither expected nor encouraged. Loss was managed as another responsibility. Social mobility remained rare. Stories of servants rising into comfort existed, but they were exceptions repeated until they sounded common. In reality, most servants remained within the class they were born into. Service offered stability, not transformation. Expectations were modest by necessity. Despite constraints, moments of satisfaction occurred. a task completed well, a system that ran smoothly, a household that functioned without disruption. These moments offered quiet pride. They affirmed competence in a world that rarely acknowledged it. Pride was internal. External validation was unnecessary and unlikely. Silence, once learned, became difficult to unlearn. Even during rare leisure, servants found themselves listening, waiting, anticipating. Rest felt incomplete. Alertness lingered. The bell existed even when it did not ring. As years passed, the future narrowed. Ambitions simplified. Stability became the goal. Avoiding catastrophe mattered more than seeking fulfillment. This was not despair. It was realism shaped by experience. At the end of each day, servants performed small rituals, shoes aligned, clothes folded, personal items checked. These actions created order in spaces where control was limited. Routine became comfort. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 did not promise reward. It promised continuity. For many, that was enough. The hidden life persisted through habit, resilience, and acceptance. Not loudly, not memorably. Just steadily, day after day, carried forward by people whose presence was essential precisely because it was never meant to be noticed. Authority was rarely questioned openly, but it was constantly assessed. Servants learned which rules were firm and which existed mostly on paper. This knowledge came from observation rather than instruction. One learned by watching what happened when others tested boundaries, often unintentionally. These lessons were remembered carefully and applied quietly. Rules about time were especially flexible for those upstairs and rigid for those below. A servant was late only once. Employers, by contrast, could delay meals, postpone instructions, or change plans without consequence. Servants adjusted automatically. Waiting became a skill. Waiting without appearing idle was an even more refined one. Workspaces downstairs reflected this imbalance. Kitchens were hot, crowded, and perpetually in use. Sculleries were damp and dim. Pantries were orderly but narrow. These rooms were designed for output, not comfort. Chairs existed, but sitting was discouraged unless explicitly permitted. Standing became the default posture of service life. Smell was an unavoidable part of the job. Coal smoke, grease, polish, damp fabric, and human effort blended into a constant background. Servants carried these smells with them, embedded in clothing and skin. Cleanliness was expected, but complete removal was impossible. This further marked the boundary between those who worked and those who were served. Written communication was limited but important. Notes left by employers were brief and directive. Servants responded through action, not writing. Literacy helped, but obedience mattered more. A servant who followed instructions precisely was valued above one who questioned them thoughtfully. Weather continued to shape the day in subtle ways. Storms meant leaks to monitor and windows to secure. Fog meant lamps lit earlier and more often. Servants were attuned to these changes, adjusting routines without being told. Anticipation reduced inconvenience upstairs. That was its purpose. Mistakes made by employers were absorbed quietly by servants. A forgotten item, a late request, a sudden change of mind. These created extra work that was completed without comment. Pointing out inconvenience was not helpful. Accommodation was expected. Adaptability was praised only when it went unnoticed. Servants developed a careful neutrality in speech. Responses were brief, polite, and non-committal. This reduced risk. Expressing enthusiasm could appear artificial. Expressing fatigue could appear resentful. Neutrality protected employment. Privacy breaches were inevitable. Servants saw letters, overheard conversations, and witnessed arguments. This knowledge was managed carefully. Forgetting was intentional. Remembering silently was required. Discretion was not a moral choice. It was a condition of continued work. Time moved differently downstairs. Hours stretched, tasks repeated. There was little sense of progression within a day. Completion was temporary. Another task always followed. Satisfaction, when it arrived, was muted and fleeting. Despite this, routines created a form of stability. Knowing what would happen next reduced anxiety. Predictability was comforting even when the content was exhausting. Uncertainty was worse than repetition. Servants measured life not by milestones but by endurance. How long one stayed in a household mattered. Longevity suggested reliability. It did not guarantee kindness or reward, but it reduced scrutiny. Familiar servants blended more completely into the background. Evening brought a slight easing of pace. Not relief exactly, just fewer instructions, fewer eyes. The house grew quieter. Servants completed final tasks with practiced efficiency, aware that errors made late were remembered longer. Before sleep, bodies signaled their limits. Joints stiffened, muscles throbbed. Fatigue settled deeply. Yet minds remained alert, tuned to bells that might ring. Rest was shallow and conditional. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 continued through this careful balance of vigilance and resignation. Days were not endured heroically. They were managed, quietly, consistently, with just enough energy saved to repeat the process again. Early mornings, when the rest of the city was just beginning to stir, were already busy for servants. The house demanded attention before the sun reached the rooftops. Fires needed tending, water carried, rooms aired. Movement had to be careful, purposeful, almost invisible. Noise was unacceptable, even from the servants themselves. Each step could be heard by someone upstairs who would notice. Meals were a constant source of labor rather than pleasure. The family's breakfast required precise timing and presentation. Servants carried dishes through corridors that were narrow and sometimes dark. Spills or dropped items were unforgivable. Meanwhile, their own food was secondary, eaten quickly and without comfort. Hunger was common but largely ignored, treated as an inevitable companion. Hierarchy within the staff shaped every interaction. Senior servants observed juniors constantly. Orders flowed downward, corrections were recorded mentally, and mistakes were rarely forgiven immediately. The butler, housekeeper, or cook maintained authority not just by rank, but by a keen awareness of who might falter. A servant's reputation depended on how well they navigated both the household and the staff hierarchy. Silence was not only a rule, but a survival skill. Conversations were minimized, laughter suppressed, opinions unspoken. Expressing emotion openly was considered dangerous, a risk that could result in reprimand or dismissal. Even casual comments could be interpreted incorrectly, and careful neutrality became a default posture. This restraint extended beyond work hours, coloring interactions among servants themselves. Cleaning, carrying, and preparing continued throughout the day. Dust returned faster than it could be removed. Floors, already polished, lost their shine within hours. Linens required constant attention. Tasks were rarely complete. Servants developed a rhythm that allowed them to keep pace without collapsing entirely, a quiet endurance that went unnoticed by the household above. Physical labor was relentless. Kneeling, bending, lifting, scrubbing. Each motion repeated dozens of times daily. Over years, bodies became accustomed to strain. Pain was internalized. Servants rarely complained, knowing that visible weakness could jeopardize their position. Endurance was a form of currency in a system that rewarded invisibility. Requests arrived unpredictably. Guests needed attention, rooms required adjustments, fires had to be maintained. Anticipation became second nature. Servants learned to read subtle cues from the household, a glance, a pause, a tone. Anticipating needs before they were spoken was safer than reacting. Failures were remembered. Competence was silently acknowledged only when it went unnoticed. Social life outside the household was tightly constrained. Visiting friends or family required permission. Even brief outings were measured against duty. Freedoms were limited, and time away often brought anxiety about returning to find the household in disarray or expectations unmet. Loyalty was enforced subtly but persistently. Even small acts of kindness from seniors or peers were noted and remembered. A quietly offered cup of tea, an overlooked spill, a brief word of acknowledgement, all provided rare relief. Such gestures were minor but meaningful, punctuating the otherwise relentless rhythm of labor and surveillance. Nighttime offered temporary respite, though sleep was light and occasionally interrupted. The bell could ring at any hour. Fires needed tending, floors had to be checked. Preparation for the next day began before rest was complete, yet even brief rest was precious, and servants valued the rare moments when they could close their eyes fully, if only for a few hours. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was measured less by accomplishments and more by survival. Routine, silence, and endurance defined existence. Work demanded constant attention, yet the work itself was designed to remain invisible. The hidden life continued quietly, day after day, shaped by rules, hierarchy, and the unspoken expectations of a world that largely ignored those who kept it functioning. Early mornings, when the rest of the city was just beginning to stir, were already busy for servants. The house demanded attention before the sun reached the rooftops. Fires needed tending, water carried, rooms aired. Movement had to be careful, purposeful, almost invisible. Noise was unacceptable, even from the servants themselves. Each step could be heard by someone upstairs who would notice. Meals were a constant source of labor rather than pleasure. The family's breakfast required precise timing and presentation. Servants carried dishes through corridors that were narrow and sometimes dark. Spills or dropped items were unforgivable. Meanwhile, their own food was secondary, eaten quickly and without comfort. Hunger was common but largely ignored. treated as an inevitable companion. Hierarchy within the staff shaped every interaction. Senior servants observed juniors constantly. Orders flowed downward. Corrections were recorded mentally, and mistakes were rarely forgiven immediately. The butler, housekeeper, or cook maintained authority not just by rank, but by a keen awareness of who might falter. A servant's reputation depended on how well they navigated both the household and the staff hierarchy. Silence was not only a rule, but a survival skill. Conversations were minimized, laughter suppressed, opinions unspoken. Expressing emotion openly was considered dangerous, a risk that could result in reprimand or dismissal. Even casual comments could be interpreted incorrectly, and careful neutrality became a default posture. This restraint extended beyond work hours, coloring interactions among servants themselves. Cleaning, carrying, and preparing continued throughout the day. Dust returned faster than it could be removed. Floors, already polished, lost their shine within hours. Linens required constant attention. Tasks were rarely complete. Servants developed a rhythm that allowed them to keep pace without collapsing entirely, a quiet endurance that went unnoticed by the household above. Physical labor was relentless. Kneeling, bending, lifting, scrubbing. Each motion repeated dozens of times daily. Over years, bodies became accustomed to strain. Pain was internalized. Servants rarely complained, knowing that visible weakness could jeopardize their position. Endurance was a form of currency in a system that rewarded invisibility. Requests arrived unpredictably. Guests needed attention, rooms required adjustments, fires had to be maintained. Anticipation became second nature. Servants learned to read subtle cues from the household, a glance, a pause, a tone. Anticipating needs before they were spoken was safer than reacting. Failures were remembered. Competence was silently acknowledged only when it went unnoticed. Social life outside the household was tightly constrained. Visiting friends or family required permission. Even brief outings were measured against duty. Freedoms were limited, and time away often brought anxiety about returning to find the household in disarray or expectations unmet. Loyalty was enforced subtly, but persistently. Even small acts of kindness from seniors or peers were noted and remembered. A quietly offered cup of tea, an overlooked spill, a brief word of acknowledgement, all provided rare relief. Such gestures were minor but meaningful, punctuating the otherwise relentless rhythm of labor and surveillance. Nighttime offered temporary respite, though sleep was light and occasionally interrupted. The bell could ring at any hour. Fires needed tending, floors had to be checked. Preparation for the next day began before rest was complete, yet even brief rest was precious, and servants valued the rare moments when they could close their eyes fully, if only for a few hours. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was measured less by accomplishments and more by survival. Routine, silence, and endurance defined existence. Work demanded constant attention, yet the work itself was designed to remain invisible. The hidden life continued quietly, day after day, shaped by rules, hierarchy, and the unspoken expectations of a world that largely ignored those who kept it functioning. Years of service carved habits deep into both body and mind. Movements became automatic: kneeling, bending, carrying, scrubbing, performed without conscious thought, yet executed precisely. Muscles remembered before the mind did. Pain was internalized, ignored, or compartmentalized. Fatigue was constant, yet function remained uninterrupted. The body was trained to endure, and the mind was trained to anticipate, to predict, to remain silent. The household itself dictated time. Bells marked the rhythm, but subtle cues, the opening of a door, the movement of a footman upstairs, the shifting light through windows, also shaped the day. Servants learned to read these signs instinctively. Each sound and movement was interpreted, recorded, and acted upon. Missing a cue was a failure. Anticipating one unobserved was mastery. Hierarchy reinforced itself in invisible ways. Senior staff were the intermediaries between employers and juniors, enforcing rules while navigating the unspoken expectations of those above. A housekeeper's glance could communicate dissatisfaction without words. A footman's pause could signal approval or warning. Reading these signals required constant attention, a skill developed over months and years. Training of newcomers was delicate. Experienced servants had to balance teaching with maintaining their own performance. Mistakes by novices reflected upon seniors. Patience was demanded even when fatigue pressed on every muscle. The responsibility of maintaining standards was heavy, yet largely unacknowledged. Social observation was continuous. Servants watched not only their superiors but each other. Interactions were measured, friendships formed cautiously, humor was muted, and alliances were practical. Trust was extended sparingly, since any breach could threaten employment. Silence was the safest form of communication, both with peers and with those above. Physical spaces shaped behavior. Kitchens, sculleries, and corridors were designed for work, not comfort. Narrow passages ensured efficiency and control. Furniture placement and room layout dictated movement. Privacy was minimal, even for senior staff. Shared quarters meant every action was performed with awareness of neighbors. Rest was regulated by routine and space. Meals were orchestrated performances. Upstairs dining required precision and speed. Servants carried trays, adjusted settings, and anticipated requests. Downstairs meals were brief and functional, eaten standing whenever possible. Hunger was normalized and tastes were utilitarian. Complaining was dangerous. Quiet endurance was expected. Health remained precarious. Minor illnesses were worked through. Injuries were treated with minimal care. Severe illness threatened dismissal, and no support system existed. Maintaining physical and mental resilience was not optional. It was survival. Seasonal and social events altered routines unpredictably. Guests, holidays, and visits increased labor, requiring adjustments and anticipation. Workload intensified, sleep shortened, and meals were skipped. Servants observed celebrations quietly, participating in preparation while remaining largely invisible to those enjoying the festivity. Evenings offered only partial respite. Tasks were completed with care, lamps extinguished, and rooms arranged for the morning. Minds remained alert, listening for bells, anticipating requests, and correcting mistakes before they occurred. Rest was conditional, sleep shallow, and awareness persistent. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was less about adventure and more about perpetual endurance. Success was measured in invisibility, continuity, and the quiet mastery of obligations. Days, months, and years repeated with subtle variations, each building upon the last. The hidden life was steady, unremarkable, yet vital, maintained by those trained to exist in service, always present, and almost never acknowledged. The passage of time sharpened skills almost imperceptibly. By the second decade of service, a servant's awareness had expanded to encompass the entire household. Every door, hallway, and staircase was mapped in memory. Every routine of every member of the household became predictable. Anticipation of needs reached a near automatic level. The ideal servant acted before a request was made and did so without drawing attention. This quiet efficiency was both learned and instinctual. Mistakes were no longer accidental. They were studied and avoided. A misaligned silverware, a smudge unnoticed, or a mislaid item could subtly shift perception of competence. Senior servants monitored patterns more than isolated incidents. Repetition of small errors was remembered. A quiet error that occurred only once might pass. Repeated, it became a mark on a record unseen but deeply felt. The house itself shaped sensory perception. Constant exposure to coal smoke, the heat of kitchens, and the chill of stone floors created a background hum of sensation that servants adapted to. Over time, smells, sounds, and textures blended into the familiar. The house was not neutral. It was lived in, known, and mapped in senses beyond sight. Relationships among staff were pragmatic. Trust was allocated with caution. Small gestures, sharing bread, covering a minor task, offering a brief word of encouragement, were treasured. Full attachment was risky. Change was constant. New hires, departures, and dismissals ensured emotional restraint. Friendships were often functional, built on shared labor rather than emotional intimacy. Time away from the household was brief and carefully measured. A walk to the market, a short visit with family, or a rare outing required permission and exact timing. These excursions offered temporary freedom, yet anxiety about returning persisted. Duties awaited. Oversight, whether direct or implied, continued to shape every moment. Physical labor remained relentless. Tasks multiplied and varied with the household's social calendar. Fireplaces needed stoking, floors cleaned, linens washed, and meals prepared. Each repetition hardened the body and trained the mind. Fatigue became permanent, integrated into the rhythm of life, yet rarely acknowledged. Servants learned to ration energy efficiently, conserving it for essential tasks. Silence remained the most powerful tool. Speaking unnecessarily invited correction or scrutiny. Expressing emotion was dangerous, even laughter was moderated. The careful cultivation of neutrality, both in speech and expression, became instinctual. Over years, silence shaped personality. Habits developed that extended beyond service hours, influencing thought and behavior in subtle ways. Health was fragile, yet maintained through practical knowledge. Minor ailments were treated quietly with home remedies. Injuries were endured. Severe illness posed serious risk, yet persistence remained the unspoken expectation. Endurance became both necessity and measure of worth. Events that interrupted the daily rhythm, guests, holidays, illness, were absorbed quietly. Servants adapted, anticipating disruptions before they occurred. Workload increased, fatigue deepened, but the appearance of competence remained paramount. Observing festivities without participation was a skill cultivated over years, requiring attention, restraint, and careful timing. At night, the household settled into a muted hum. Fires dimmed, footsteps slowed, and conversation softened. Servants completed final checks, ensuring everything was in place for the morning. Then they returned to shared quarters, removing uniforms, aligning personal items, and preparing for the repetition of labor. Sleep came conditionally, shadowed by anticipation. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was defined less by events and more by the quiet mastery of routine. Success was measured in invisibility, endurance, and the absence of mistakes. Each day built upon the last, creating a continuum of hidden labor. The hidden life persisted, steady and unremarkable, essential precisely because it was nearly invisible to those it served. Seasonal cycles imposed new demands with each turn of the year. Winter mornings brought frozen pipes, heavy boots, and fires that needed constant tending. Snow and ice made carrying water and coal more arduous, and every surface became slippery and treacherous. Summer heat created its own strain, especially in kitchens where fires blazed all day. Servants endured these extremes silently, adjusting routines without complaint. Comfort was never expected. Adaptation was the measure of success. Clothing and uniforms remained a constant concern. Garments were practical, durable, and often ill-fitting. They marked the wearer as part of the service class. Mending was done quietly, usually after the day's labor was complete, by dim candlelight or the faint glow of a hearth. Worn clothing became a visible record of effort and endurance. Pride was private, reflected in neat folds, polished shoes, and crisp collars. Recognition rarely came from above. Communication within staff was subtle. A glance, a pause, a tone could convey approval or warning. Novices learned quickly by observing responses and corrections directed at others. Misreading these cues could have consequences far beyond the immediate task. Learning the unspoken language of service was as important as mastering physical labor. Meals continued to structure the day. Upstairs, dining was formal, precise, and demanding. Downstairs, eating was utilitarian. Servants' nourishment was functional, often sparse, and eaten standing when time was limited. Hunger was accepted as normal. Discussion about food was uncommon. Gratitude, though minimal, was expected. The contrast between upstairs enjoyment and downstairs necessity was constant. Hierarchy dictated interactions. Senior staff enforced rules while remaining under scrutiny themselves. A butler or housekeeper wielded authority carefully, balancing the needs of the household with oversight of subordinates. Junior staff navigated this structure with caution, understanding that missteps could ripple upwards. Social navigation was constant, silent, and essential. Health and hygiene remained precarious. Minor illnesses were tolerated and worked through. Severe conditions were dangerous, risking dismissal or the inability to complete essential tasks. Knowledge of practical remedies was vital. Experience shaped responses. Physical resilience was silently demanded, and those who could not endure were quietly replaced. Friendship and companionship existed in measured doses. Staff shared small gestures, brief conversations, and minor acts of support. Emotional investment was calculated. Change was inevitable. New hires arrived, others left. Attachments were restrained. Bonds were often functional rather than deeply personal. This created a careful balance between connection and self-preservation. Observation remained constant. Servants noted habits, moods, and preferences. Anticipation was more valuable than reaction. Predicting needs before they were expressed marked competence. Failure to anticipate signaled incompetence, even if performance was otherwise flawless. The ideal servant was present without being noticed, alert without disturbing. Evening brought only partial relief. Final tasks required attention, extinguishing lamps, checking locks, preparing rooms, arranging items for the morning. Rest came conditionally. Sleep was shallow, interrupted, and shadowed by awareness of the bell or sudden demands. Quiet vigilance remained part of the night. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was a continuous exercise in endurance, observation, and silent competence. Success was measured in the absence of notice, in the smooth functioning of a household, and in the unbroken repetition of labor. The hidden life was steady, unremarkable, and sustained by those trained to work invisibly, efficiently, and consistently, day after day. Over time, the monotony of daily tasks shaped both perception and character. Servants became intimately familiar with every corner of the household, the creak of stair boards, the particular echo of a hallway, the distinct smell of coal smoke in each room. Awareness extended beyond sight, encompassing sound, touch, and even the subtle shifts in air. This knowledge allowed them to navigate and work efficiently, often without conscious thought, yet it also reinforced the boundaries of their existence. Constant vigilance within a limited domain. Mistakes accumulated weight silently. A teacup placed slightly askew, a dusted shelf that still bore smudges, a fire not banked just right. All could reflect poorly on a servant's competence. Each error, however minor, contributed to an invisible ledger maintained by senior staff and internalized by the servant. Reputation depended on managing these small details consistently, and awareness of this fact imposed a subtle, ongoing pressure. Social interaction among staff was functional and carefully measured. Friendships existed but were cautious. Small gestures, sharing a loaf of bread, covering a minor error, or offering a whispered word of encouragement were treasured. Emotional attachment was tempered by constant flux. New servants arrived, others departed, and dismissals could occur without warning. Bonds were practical rather than intimate, designed to support survival rather than satisfaction. The rhythm of meals structured the day. Upstairs, dining was formal, elaborate, and strictly timed. Downstairs, eating was utilitarian and often rushed. Servant sustenance was functional, consumed quickly, and sometimes skipped. Hunger was normalized and rarely discussed. Gratitude, even if minimal or reluctant, was expected. The contrast between the ease and indulgence of those served and the restraint of those serving was constant and quietly instructive. Hierarchy maintained order with subtlety. Senior staff enforced rules and monitored performance, themselves accountable to the household. A housekeeper or butler exercised authority carefully, balancing enforcement with their own survival. Junior staff navigated these relationships attentively, aware that minor misjudgments could cascade into consequences. Social skill, discretion, and patience were as essential as physical labor. Physical labor remained relentless. Fires were tended, floors scrubbed, linens washed, and meals prepared with meticulous precision. Repetition hardened the body while honing attention. Fatigue became a constant companion, integrated into daily rhythm, yet largely invisible to observers. Energy was rationed carefully, conserved for essential tasks, and deployed silently. Silence was cultivated continuously. Speech was minimized, expression controlled. Laughter was muted, complaints suppressed, opinions withheld. Neutrality became habitual. The mind, trained in constant observation and restraint, carried over these patterns even outside work hours. Expression became rare, calibrated, and deliberate. Health was precarious. Minor ailments were endured, injuries treated minimally, severe illness risking employment. Resilience was an unspoken requirement, cultivated through experience and necessity. Knowledge of practical remedies, self-care, and timing allowed continued function, often at the expense of comfort. The household imposed invisible pressures. Guests, holidays, illness, and social events introduced irregularity. Servants anticipated disruptions, adjusted workflows, and maintained appearances. Participation in celebrations was limited to preparation, observation, and silent efficiency. Pleasure was rare, labor was constant. Night offered only conditional respite. Tasks concluded, items arranged, fires banked, and doors checked. Sleep arrived under the weight of anticipation. The bell might ring at any hour, and the mind remained attuned to the household's subtle rhythms. Rest was brief and measured. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was defined by endurance, vigilance, and the quiet mastery of invisible labor. Success was measured by continuity, competence, and the absence of notice. Days repeated, seasons cycled, and the hidden life persisted, steady, unremarkable, and sustained by those trained to exist in quiet service, ever present, yet largely unseen. As the years unfolded, servants developed an acute sense of timing. Every sound, gesture, and environmental change became a cue for action. The slightest hesitation could be interpreted as incompetence. Anticipation was not optional, it was expected. From lighting fires before anyone noticed they were low to placing utensils exactly as preferred, the work required constant cognitive engagement alongside physical labor. Errors were cumulative, often remembered long after the task itself was complete. Hierarchy remained a defining structure. Senior staff wielded authority carefully, balancing enforcement with survival. Junior servants navigated this layered system, conscious that each interaction could ripple upward. Missteps were seldom immediately addressed, but they were noted, silently shaping reputations. Competence was recognized subtly, often only by the absence of criticism. Observing the household became second nature. Patterns in behavior, preferred routines, and moods of employers were studied and internalized. A glance, a pause, a tone could convey satisfaction, irritation, or expectation. These signals informed every action, guiding movements and decisions throughout the day. Being unnoticed was the highest compliment. Drawing attention was dangerous. Physical spaces dictated movement. Kitchens, sculleries, and corridors were designed for efficiency, not comfort. Narrow staircases and heavy doors required calculated effort. Every step was considered, every movement controlled. Awareness of one's surroundings was constant. Silence was maintained, not just to avoid reprimand, but because it was expected as part of service decorum. Food remained functional. Meals upstairs were elaborate performances. Downstairs, sustenance was quick, practical, and often minimal. Hunger was normalized. Discussion of appetite was discouraged. Gratitude, even if faint, was required. This contrast between abundance above and restraint below was ingrained into daily experience. Health was fragile, but self-preservation was learned. Minor injuries were treated quietly. Illnesses endured unless incapacitating. Those who could not maintain physical resilience were quietly replaced. Knowledge of simple remedies and techniques for enduring discomfort became an essential part of survival. Friendships were functional and measured. Bonds were formed slowly, often between those who shared tasks or responsibilities. Attachments were restrained, as the fluidity of employment made deep connection risky. Acts of kindness covering duties, sharing food, quiet reassurance were treasured, small reprieves in a demanding world. Seasonal change dictated workload. Winters brought frozen pipes and heavy fires. Summers intensified heat in kitchens. Rain turned streets to mud. Snow made transport treacherous. Servants adapted seamlessly, demonstrating endurance rather than comfort. Comfort was never expected. Adaptation was the measure of competence. Evenings offered partial relief. Tasks concluded, fires banked, rooms prepared for the morning. Yet mental alertness remained. Sleep arrived in shallow waves, often interrupted by thought or the distant sound of the bell. Rest was provisional, earned through vigilance. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 persisted through a careful balance of endurance, observation, and silent mastery. Success was defined not by recognition but by continuity. Invisible labor, sustained day after day, created the hidden life steady, unremarkable yet essential to the functioning of households that relied on it without noticing. Experience deepened observation. Years of service honed the ability to notice small details that others overlooked: a misplaced chair, a slightly uneven napkin, a door not fully closed. These cues guided action, allowing the servant to correct issues before they were noticed by employers. Anticipation became instinctive. The ideal servant acted without being asked and without drawing attention. This quiet skill was both invisible and indispensable. Mistakes, even minor ones, were remembered. A spilled drink, a slightly misaligned tray, or a polished surface that retained a smudge could reflect poorly. Accumulated errors rather than isolated incidents shaped reputation. Competence was recognized silently in the absence of criticism, and a lapse could quietly alter one's standing. Interaction with other staff remained cautious. Relationships were functional. Friendships formed slowly and were tempered by practical considerations. Attachments were limited. Change was constant. Newcomers arrived, others left. Dismissals occurred without warning. Trust was cautious, extended selectively, and tested through shared labor. Gestures of kindness were small, meaningful, and often rare. Meals continued to structure the day. Upstairs dining required precision, timing, and composure. Downstairs meals were utilitarian, often hurried, consumed standing and with minimal discussion. Hunger was normalized. Gratitude was expected, even if reluctantly expressed. The contrast between those served and those serving underscored the social structure quietly, daily. Hierarchy shaped every movement. Senior staff directed juniors while themselves being accountable to those above. Subtle cues, glances, pauses, tones communicated approval, disapproval, or expectation. Understanding these signals was essential. Misreading them could create tension or risk employment. The best servants remained adaptable, alert, and nearly invisible. Physical labor persisted relentlessly. Scrubbing, hauling, polishing, and tending fires repeated daily. Muscles adapted, endurance became habitual, and fatigue was internalized. The mind remained sharp, coordinating anticipation with execution. Efficiency was both demanded and assumed. Silence was cultivated carefully. Speaking without necessity risked censure. Humor and emotion were muted. Expression was restrained, habitual, and extended beyond work into personal life. Neutrality became second nature. Health was precarious. Illness or injury threatened livelihood. Minor ailments were endured, remedies were practical. Resilience became a survival skill. Those unable to cope were quietly replaced. Knowledge of the body, fatigue, and simple cures was essential. Seasonal and social events dictated sudden changes in routine. Guests, celebrations, and household disruptions required adaptation. Servants anticipated these shifts, adjusted workflows, and maintained discretion. Participation was preparation and observation rather than enjoyment. Labor remained constant. At night, tasks concluded, spaces arranged, and fires banked. Sleep was conditional, shallow, and often interrupted. Rest was valued, but never complete. Anticipation of the next day's demands lingered in thought and body. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was defined by continuity, endurance, and quiet competence. Success was measured in invisibility, reliability, and sustained labor. Each day, repeated with subtle variation, reinforced the hidden life, steady, essential, and largely unacknowledged. The long passage of service instilled a sense of rhythm in both body and mind. Every task, every movement, every sound became part of a predictable cycle. Footsteps, door hinges, the faint clatter of dishes. These were markers of time as reliable as the clock. Servants adjusted instinctively, moving in harmony with the household's daily flow. Anticipation was constant. Reaction was a skill refined over years. Mistakes carried consequences beyond immediate tasks. A mislaid item, an incorrectly arranged table, or a forgotten fire left an imprint in the household's unspoken ledger. Each lapse was noted, and patterns were remembered. Competence was measured less by speed than by the absence of error. Perfection was invisible. Flaws were conspicuous. Social connections among staff were deliberate and cautious. Friendships formed slowly, based on reliability and mutual survival. Emotional investments were restrained, attachments tempered by the impermanence of employment. Acts of kindness covering another's task, sharing food, or offering quiet encouragement were treasured. These small gestures provided fleeting relief in an otherwise exacting environment. The structure of meals framed the day. Upstairs dining was formal and precise. Downstairs, sustenance was quick, minimal, and functional. Hunger was common. Gratitude, even if faint, was expected. The contrast between those served and those serving reinforced the hierarchy silently, daily. Servants internalized this separation, rarely questioning its permanence. Hierarchy remained an invisible guiding force. Senior staff enforced rules and set expectations, themselves accountable to the household. Subtle cues, pauses, glances, shifts in tone communicated meaning. Misreading these cues could have consequences. Observation, discretion, and adaptability were as vital as physical labor. Physical work was relentless. Scrubbing floors, polishing metal, hauling water, and tending fires occupied hours. Fatigue was constant, but the body adapted. Efficiency was expected and internalized. Rest was temporary and measured in moments rather than hours. Silence continued to shape behavior. Speaking unnecessarily risked correction. Expressing emotion or humor was rare. Neutrality became a default, extended beyond work hours into interactions among staff. The practice of restraint became second nature. Health was fragile. Minor illness was endured. Injury was treated minimally. Severe conditions threatened employment. Resilience, awareness of bodily limits, and knowledge of remedies were essential. Adaptation was a prerequisite for survival. Unexpected events, visitors, celebrations, or sudden household changes required adjustment. Workload increased, vigilance intensified, and the appearance of competence remained paramount. Servants participated indirectly, ensuring smooth operations while remaining largely invisible. Evenings offered partial respite. Tasks concluded, fires banked, and rooms arranged for the morning. Yet mental alertness persisted. Sleep arrived conditionally, shallow, and sometimes interrupted. Anticipation of the bell or new instructions lingered. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was sustained through routine, discipline, and quiet competence. Success was defined by continuity, endurance, and invisibility. Each day repeated the last, creating a hidden life that was steady, essential, and largely unrecognized, yet carried forward with remarkable skill and resilience. Experience refined every action. Years of service sharpened instincts, honed anticipation, and deepened awareness of both the household and fellow staff. Every task, lighting fires, polishing silver, arranging furniture, was performed with practiced precision. Movements became automatic, yet guided by acute observation. The ideal servant acted without instruction, corrected minor issues before they became visible, and remained largely unnoticed. Mastery of invisibility became the hallmark of competence. Mistakes were internalized, remembered silently, and rarely forgiven immediately. A misaligned plate, a smudged floor, a misplaced item, all carried consequences that rippled through reputation. Accumulation mattered more than singular errors. Competence was demonstrated not by praise but by absence of criticism. Invisible labor, when performed correctly, left no trace, yet its omission was obvious. Social dynamics among servants required constant negotiation. Friendships were cautious, loyalty measured, and emotional investment restrained. New hires arrived, others departed. Dismissals occurred without warning. Trust was extended sparingly. Small gestures, covering a task, offering food, whispering advice, were valued highly. Bonds were practical, essential to maintaining the flow of labor and mutual survival. Meals structured daily rhythm. Upstairs, dining required formality, precision, and attentiveness. Downstairs, food was functional, eaten quickly, and often standing. Hunger was accepted as normal. Gratitude, minimal or reluctant, was expected. The contrast reinforced hierarchy daily. Servants internalized this separation quietly. Hierarchy guided action. Senior staff directed juniors while themselves being accountable. Cues, tones, glances, pauses conveyed approval or warning. Misreading them risked censure or reduced standing. Understanding these subtleties was as critical as completing physical tasks. Observation, discretion, and adaptability were continuously exercised. Physical labor was relentless. Scrubbing floors, hauling water, tending fires, polishing surfaces. Tasks repeated daily, building endurance while hardening fatigue into routine. Efficiency was assumed. Rest was provisional. Physical resilience was silently demanded, cultivated over years and reinforced by repetition. Silence governed behavior. Speaking unnecessarily risked reprimand. Emotional display was discouraged. Neutrality, cultivated over time, became habitual. Even outside work, restraint influenced interaction and self-expression. It shaped personality subtly, enduring beyond the household. Health remained precarious. Minor ailments were tolerated, injuries treated minimally. Severe illness threatened continued employment. Knowledge of practical remedies and bodily endurance became essential. Adaptation to pain and strain was routine. Seasonal and social variations affected labor. Guests, celebrations, illness, and household disruptions brought temporary upheaval. Servants adapted seamlessly, maintaining standards and discretion. Participation was preparation and observation rather than enjoyment. Night offered limited relief. Tasks completed, fires banked, rooms arranged for the morning. Sleep arrived shallowly, often interrupted by thought or anticipation of the bell. Rest was earned, provisional, and measured. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was defined by endurance, routine, and quiet mastery. Success was measured by invisibility, reliability, and sustained labor. The hidden life persisted steadily, essential and largely unacknowledged, carried forward by those trained to be ever-present yet unseen. By the final stage of a servant's career, routine had become second nature. Every motion, every sound, every sequence of labor was ingrained. The body moved efficiently through tasks with minimal conscious thought, guided by memory, habit, and anticipation. The mind remained alert, tracking details that could affect reputation or efficiency. Actions were performed quietly, seamlessly, and invisibly, preserving the household's appearance while bearing the full weight of labor. Mistakes were rare, but when they occurred, they were remembered internally and subtly corrected. Even minor lapses, a smudge on a polished surface, a slightly misaligned napkin, or a forgotten adjustment could create ripples in perception. Competence was measured in absence of notice. Praise was rare. Silence was the standard acknowledgement. Invisible mastery, when maintained, was itself reward enough. Social dynamics among staff had become delicate and efficient. Bonds existed, but they were measured. Friendships were tempered by necessity. Emotional attachment was restrained. The constant flux of personnel arrivals, departures, dismissals required careful balance. Small gestures offering help, sharing knowledge, or covering a task were treasured as fleeting acts of camaraderie and practical support. Meals continued to shape rhythm. Upstairs, dining demanded formality, attention, and precision. Downstairs, sustenance was functional, minimal, and consumed quickly. Hunger was normalized. Gratitude was expected. The contrast between upstairs abundance and downstairs labor reinforced hierarchy. Servants internalized their place, rarely questioning it, and maintained professional detachment. Hierarchy dictated every interaction. Senior staff monitored juniors while remaining accountable to the household. Nonverbal cues, glances, pauses, shifts in tone conveyed expectation or reprimand. Misreading these subtle signals could jeopardize employment. Observation, discretion, and adaptability were essential skills, developed over years and executed instinctively. Physical labor persisted relentlessly. Scrubbing, hauling, polishing, and tending fires demanded endurance. Fatigue was constant, yet bodies adapted. Energy was rationed carefully, preserved for essential tasks. Efficiency was assumed. Any lapse could attract notice. Physical resilience was silently demanded, cultivated through repetition, and maintained over decades. Silence was habitual, speech was minimized, emotion suppressed. Neutrality governed demeanor. These patterns extended beyond work, shaping personality and interaction even in private moments. Restraint became instinctive, a survival mechanism and a mark of professionalism. Health remained fragile. Minor ailments were endured, injuries treated with minimal care. Severe illness posed real risk. Servants developed knowledge of remedies and bodily limits. Adaptation to pain and strain was routine, a skill critical for survival. Evenings offered only partial respite. Tasks concluded, spaces arranged, fires banked. Sleep was shallow, interrupted, and always shadowed by anticipation of the next day. Rest was conditional and carefully measured. Preparation for repetition began before the day had fully ended. Life as a Victorian servant in 1885 was defined by endurance, precision, and invisible mastery. Success was measured not by recognition but by the ability to sustain labor, anticipate needs, and remain unseen. The hidden life persisted steadily, quietly, and unremarkably, carried forward by those whose work was essential precisely because it was almost never noticed.